Section 16 of The Good Soldier, A Tale of Passion. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mike Venditti. The Good Soldier, A Tale of Passion by Madox Ford. Part 4, Chapter 2. Well, that about brings me up to date of my receiving in Waterbury the laconic cable from Edward, to the effect that he wanted me to go to Branshaw and have a chat. I was pretty busy at the time, and I was half-minded to send him a reply cable to the effect that I would start in a fortnight. But I was having a long interview with old Mr. Hurlbird's attorneys, and immediately afterwards I had to have a long interview with the Mrs. Hurlbird, so I delayed cabling. I had expected to find the Mrs. Hurlbird excessively old, in the 90s or thereabouts. The time passed so slowly that I had the impression that it must have been 30 years since I had been in the United States. It was only 12 years. Actually, Miss Hurlbird was just 61 and Miss Florence Hurlbird 59, and they were both mentally and physically as vigorous as could be desired. They were indeed more vigorous mentally than suited my purpose, which was to get away from the United States as quickly as I could. The Hurlbirds were an exceedingly united family, exceedingly united except on one set of points. Each of the three of them had a separate doctor whom they trusted implicitly, and each a separate attorney, and each of them distrusted the other's doctor and the other's attorney. And naturally the doctors and the attorneys warned one all the time against each other. You cannot imagine how complicated it all became for me. Of course, I had an attorney of my own, recommended to me by young Carter, my Philadelphia nephew. I do not mean to say that there was any unpleasantness of a grasping kind. The problem was quite another one, a moral dilemma. You see, old Mr. Hurlbird had left all his property to Florence with the mere request that she would have erected to him in the city of Waterbury, Illinois, a memorial that should take the form of some sort of institution for the relief of sufferers from the heart. Florence's money had all come to me, and with it old Mr. Hurlbird's. He had died just 5 days before Florence. Well, I was quite ready to spend a round $1 million on the relief of sufferers from the heart. The old gentleman had left about $1.5 million. Florence had been worth about $800,000, and as I figured it out, I should cut up about $1 million myself. Anyhow, there was ample money, but I naturally wanted to consult the wishes of his surviving relatives. And then the trouble really began. You see, it had been discovered that Mr. Hurlbird had nothing whatever the matter with his heart. His lungs had been a little affected all through his life, and he had died of bronchitis. It struck Miss Florence Hurlbird that since her brother had died of lungs and not the heart, his money ought to go to lung patients. That, she considered, was what her brother would have wished. On the other hand, by a kink that I could not at the time understand, Miss Hurlbird insisted that I ought to keep the money all to myself. She said that she did not wish for any monuments to the Hurlbird family. At the time I thought that was because of a New England dislike for necrological ostentation. But I can figure out now, when I remember certain insistent and continued questions that she put to me about Edward Ashburnham, that there was another idea in her mind. And Leonora has told me that, on Florence's dressing table beside her dead body, there had lain a letter to Miss Hurlbird, a letter which Leonora posted without telling me. I don't know how Florence had time to write to her aunt, but I can quite understand that she would not like to go out of the world without making some comments. So I guess Florence had told Miss Hurlbird a good bit about Edward Ashburnham in a few scrawled words, and that was why the old lady did not wish the name of Hurlbird perpetuated. Perhaps also she thought that I had earned the Hurlbird money. It meant a pretty tidy lot of discussing. What with the doctors warning each other about the bad effects of discussions on the health of the old ladies, and warning me covertly against each other, and saying that old Mr Hurlbird might have died of heart after all, in spite of the diagnosis of his doctor. And the solicitors all had separate methods of arranging about how the money should be invested and entrusted and bound. Personally, I wanted to invest the money so that the interest could be used for the relief of sufferers from the heart. If old Mr Hurlbird had not died of any defects in that organ, he had considered that it was defective. Moreover, Florence had certainly died of her heart, as I saw it, and when Miss Florence Hurlbird stood out that the money ought to go to chest sufferers, I was brought to thinking that there ought to be a chest institution too, and I advanced a sum that I was ready to provide to $1.5 million. That would have given $750,000 to each class of invalid. I did not want money at all badly. All I wanted it for was to be able to give Nancy Rufford a good time. I did not know much about housekeeping expenses in England, where I presumed she would wish to live. I knew that her needs at that time were limited to good chocolates and a good horse or two, and simple, pretty frocks. Probably she would want more than that later on, but even if I gave $1.5 million to those institutions, I should still have the equivalent of about $20,000 a year English, and I considered that Nancy could have a pretty good time on that or less. Anyhow, we had a stiff set of arguments up at the Hurlbird mansion, which stands on a bluff over the town. It may strike you, silent listener, as being funny if you happen to be European, but moral problems of that description and the giving of millions to institutions are immensely serious matters in my country. Indeed, they are the staple topics for consideration amongst the wealthy classes. We haven't got peerage and social climbing to occupy us much, and decent people do not take interest in politics or elderly people in sport. So that there were real tears shed by Miss Hurlbird and Miss Florence before I left that city. I left it quite abruptly. 4 hours after Edward's telegram came another from Leonora saying, "Yes, do come. You could be so helpful." I simply told my attorney that there was the $1.5 million, that he could invest it as he liked, and that the purposes must be decided by the Misses Hurlbird. I was, anyhow, pretty well worn out by all the discussions, and as I have never heard yet from the Misses Hurlbird, I rather think that Miss Hurlbird, either by revelations or by moral force, has persuaded Miss Florence that no memorial to their names shall be erected in the city of Waterbury, Connecticut. Miss Hurlbird wept dreadfully when she heard that I was going to stay with the Ashburnhams, but she did not make any comments. I was aware, at that date, that her niece had been seduced by that fellow Jimmy before I had married her, but I contrived to produce on her the impression that I thought Florence had been a model wife. Why, at that date, I still believed that Florence had been perfectly virtuous after her marriage to me. I had not figured it out that she could have played it so low down as to continue her intrigue with that fellow under my roof. Well, I was a fool, but I did not think much about Florence at that date. My mind was occupied with what was happening at Branshaw. I had got it into my head that the telegrams had something to do with Nancy. It struck me that she might have shown signs of forming an attachment for some undesirable fellow, and that Leonora wanted me to come back and marry her, out of harm's way. That was what was pretty firmly in my mind, and it remained in my mind for nearly 10 days after my arrival at that beautiful old place. Neither Edward or Leonora made any motion to talk to me about anything other than the weather and the crops. Yet, although there were several young fellows about, I could not see that anyone in particular was distinguished by the girl's preference. She certainly appeared illish and nervous, except when she woke up to talk gay nonsense to me. Oh, the pretty thing that she was! I imagined that what must have happened was that the undesirable young man had been forbidden the place and that Nancy was fretting a little. What had happened was just hell. Leonora had spoken to Nancy. Nancy had spoken to Edward. Edward had spoken to Leonora. And they had talked and talked and talked. You have to imagine horrible pictures of gloom and half-lights and emotions running through silent nights, through whole nights. You have to imagine my beautiful Nancy appearing suddenly to Edward, rising up at the foot of his bed, with her long hair falling like a split cone of shadow in the glimmer of a night light that burned beside him. You have to imagine her, a silent, and no doubt agonized figure, like a spectre, suddenly offering herself to him to save his reason. And you have to imagine his frantic refusal, and talk and talk. My God! And yet, to me, living in the house, enveloped with the charm of the quiet and ordered living, with the silent, skilled servants who were laying out my dress clothes, was like a caress. To me, who was hourly with them, they appeared like tender, ordered and devoted people, smiling, absenting themselves at the proper intervals, driving me to meets, just good people. How the devil do they do it? At dinner one evening Leonora said she had just opened a telegram. Nancy will be going to India tomorrow to be with her father. No one spoke. Nancy looked at her plate. Edward went on eating his pheasant. I felt very bad. I imagined that it would be up to me to propose to Nancy that evening. It appeared to me to be queer that they had not given me any warning of Nancy's departure. But I thought that that was only English manners, some sort of delicacy that I had not got the hang of. You must remember that at that moment I trusted in Edward and Leonora, and in Nancy Rufford, and in the tranquillity of ancient haunts of peace, as I had trusted in my mother's love. And that evening Edward spoke to me. What in the interval had happened had been this. Upon her return from Nauheim, Leonora had completely broken down, because she knew she could trust Edward. That seems odd, but if you know anything about breakdowns you will know that by the ingenious torments that fate prepares for us, these things come as soon as, a strain having relaxed, there is nothing more to be done. It is after a husband's long illness and death that a widow goes to pieces. It is at the end of a long rowing contest that a crew collapses and lies forward upon its oars. And that was what happened to Leonora. From certain tones in Edward's voice, from the long, steady stare that he had given her from his bloodshot eyes on rising from dinner-table in the Nauheim hotel, she knew that in the affair of the poor girl this was a case in which Edward's moral scruples, or his social code, or his idea that it would be playing it too low down, rendered Nancy perfectly safe. The girl, she felt sure, was in no danger at all from Edward, and in that she was perfectly right. The smash was to come from herself. She relaxed, she broke, she drifted, at first quickly, then with an increasing momentum, down the stream of destiny. You may put it that, having been cut off from the restraints of her religion for the first time in her life, she acted along the lines of her instinctive desires. I do not know whether to think that in that she was no longer herself, that, having let loose the bonds of her standards, her conventions, and her traditions, she was being for the first time her own natural self. She was torn between her intense maternal love for the girl and an intense jealousy of the woman who realizes that the man she loves has met what appears to be the final passion of his life. She was divided between an intense disgust for Edward's weakness in conceiving this passion and intense pity for the miseries that he was enduring, and a feeling equally intense, but one that she hid from herself, a feeling of respect for Edward's determination to keep himself in this particular affair unspotted. And the human heart is a very mysterious thing. It is impossible to say that Leonora, in acting as she did, was not filled with a sort of hatred of Edward's final virtue. She wanted, I think, to despise him. He was, she realized, gone from her for good. Then let him suffer, let him agonize, let him, if possible, break and go to that hell that is the abode of broken resolves. She might have taken a different line. It would have been so easy to send the girl away, to stay with some friends, to have taken her away herself upon some pretext or other. That would not have cured things, but it would have been the decent line. But at that date poor Leonora was incapable of taking any line whatever. She pitied Edward frightfully at one time, and then she acted along the lines of pity. She loathed him at another, and then she acted as her loathing dictated. She gasped as a person dying of tuberculosis gasps for air. She craved madly for communication with some other human soul, and the human soul that she selected was that of the girl. Perhaps Nancy was the only person that she could have talked to. With her necessity for reticences, with her coldness of manner, Leonora had singularly few intimates. She had none at all, with the exception of the Mrs. Colonel Wayland, who had advised her about the affair with La Dolciquita, and the one or two religious who had guided her through life. The Colonel's wife was at that time in Madeira. The religious she now avoided. Her visitor's book had 700 names in it. There was not a soul that she could speak to. She was Mrs. Ashburnham of Branshaw Telegraph. She was the great Mrs. Ashburnham of Branshaw, and she lay all day upon her bed in her marvellous, light, airy bedroom, with the chintzes and the Chippendale, and the portraits of deceased Ashburnhams by Zoffany and Zucchero. When there was a meet, she would struggle up, supposing it were within driving distance, and let Edward drive her and the girl to the crossroads or the country house. She would drive herself back alone. Edward would ride off with the girl. Ride Leonora could not, that season. Her head was too bad. Each pace of her mare was an anguish. But she drove with efficiency and precision. She smiled at the Grimmers and the Volkoffs and the Hedley Setons. She threw with exactitude pennies to the boys who opened gate for her. She sat upright on the seat of the high dog-cart. She waved her hands to Edward and Nancy as they rode off with the hounds, and everyone could hear her clear, high voice in the chilly weather, saying, "Have a good time." Poor, forlorn woman! There was, however, one spark of consolation. It came from the fact that Rodney Bayham of Bayham followed her always with his eyes. It had been 3 years since she had tried her abortive love affair with him, yet still, on the winter mornings, he would ride up to her shafts and just say, "Good day," and look at her with eyes that were not imploring, but seemed to say, "You see, I am still, as the Germans say, A.D. at disposition." It was a great consolation, not because she proposed ever to take him up again, but because it showed her that there was in the world one faithful soul in riding breeches, and it showed her that she was not losing her looks. And, indeed, she was not losing her looks. She was 40, but she was as clean run as the day she had left the convent, as clear in outline, as clear-coloured in the hair, as dark blue in the eyes. She thought that her looking-glass told her this, but there are always the doubts. Rodney Bayham's eyes took them away. It is very singular that Leonora should not have aged at all. I suppose that there are some types of beauty and even of youth made for the embellishments that come with enduring sorrow. That is too elaborately put. I mean that Leonora, if everything had prospered, might have become too hard and maybe overbearing. As it was, she was tuned down to appearing efficient and yet sympathetic. That is the rarest of all blends. And yet I swear that Leonora, in her restrained way, gave the impression of being intensely sympathetic. When she listened to you, she appeared also to be listening to some sound that was going on in the distance, but still she listened to you and took in what you said, which, since the record of humanity is a record of sorrows, was, as a rule, something sad. I think that she must have taken Nancy through many terrors of the night and many bad places of the day, and that would account for the girl's passionate love for the elder woman. For Nancy's love for Leonora was an admiration that is awakened in Catholics by their feeling for the Virgin Mary and for various of the saints. It is too little to say that the girl would have laid her life at Leonora's feet. Well, she laid there the offer of her virtue and her reason. Those were sufficient installments of her life. It would today be much better for Nancy Rufford if she were dead. Perhaps all these reflections are a nuisance, but they crowd on me. I will try to tell the story. You see, when she came back from Newham, Leonora began to have her headaches lasting through whole days, during which she could speak no word and could bear to hear no sound. And day after day Nancy would sit with her, silent and motionless, for hours, steeping handkerchiefs in vinegar and water, and thinking her own thoughts. It must have been very bad for her, and her meals alone with Edward must have been bad for her too, and beastly bad for Edward. Edward, of course, wavered in his demeanour. What else could he do? At times he would sit silent and dejected over his untouched food. He would utter nothing but monosyllables when Nancy spoke to him. Then he was simply afraid of the girl falling in love with him. At other times he would take a little wine, pull himself together, attempt to chaff Nancy about a stake and binder hedge that her mare had checked at, or talk about the habits of the Chitralis. That was when he was thinking that it was rough on the poor girl that he should have become a dull companion. He realized that his talking to her in the park at Nehime had done her no harm. But all that was doing a great deal of harm to Nancy. It gradually opened her eyes to the fact that Edward was a man with his ups and downs, and not an invariably gay uncle like a nice dog, a trustworthy horse, or a girl friend. She would find him in attitudes of frightful dejection, sunk into his armchair in the study that was half a gun-room. She would notice through the open door that his face was the face of an old, dead man, when he had no one to talk to. Gradually it forced itself upon her attention that there were profound differences between the pair that she regarded as her uncle and her aunt. It was a conviction that came very slowly. It began with Edward's giving an oldish horse to a young fellow called Selmes. Selmes' father had been ruined by a fraudulent solicitor, and the Selmes family had to sell their hunters. It was a case that had excited a good deal of sympathy in that part of the county, and Edward, meeting the young man one day, unmounted, and seeing him to be very unhappy, had offered to give him an old Irish cob upon which he was riding. It was a silly sort of thing to do, really. The horse was worth from £30 to £40, and Edward might have known that the gift would upset his wife. But Edward just had to comfort that unhappy young man, whose father he had known all his life. And it made it all the worse that young Selmes could not afford to keep the horse even. Edward recollected this immediately after he had made the offer, and said quickly, "Of course, I mean that you should stable the horse at Barnshaw until you have time to turn round or want to sell him and get a better." Nancy went straight home and told all this to Leonora, who was lying down. She regarded it as a splendid instance of Edward's quick consideration for the feelings and the circumstances of the distressed. She thought it would cheer Leonora up, because it ought to cheer any woman up to know that she had such a splendid husband. That was the last girlish thought she ever had. For Leonora, whose headache had left her collected but miserably weak, turned upon her bed and uttered words that were amazing to the girl. "I wish to God," she said, "that he was your husband and not mine. We shall be ruined. We shall be ruined. Am I never to have a chance?" And suddenly Leonora burst into a passion of tears. She pushed herself up from the pillows with one elbow and sat there, crying, with her face hidden in her hands and the tears falling through her fingers. The girl flushed, stammered and whimpered, as if she had been personally insulted. "But if Uncle Edward," she began. "That man," said Leonora, with an extraordinary bitterness, "would give the shirt off his back and off mine and off yours to any—" She could not finish the sentence. At that moment she had been feeling an extraordinary hatred and contempt for her husband. All the morning and all the afternoon she had been lying there thinking that Edward and the girl were together, in the field and hacking at home at dusk. She had been digging her sharp nails into her palms. The house had been very silent in the drooping winter weather. then, after an eternity of torture, there had invaded it the sound of opening doors, of the girl's gay voice saying, "Well, it was only under the mistletoe." And there was Edward's gruff undertone. Then Nancy had come in, with feet that had hastened up the stairs and that tiptoed as they approached the open door of Leonora's room. Branshaw had a great big hall with oak floors and tiger skins. Round this hall there ran a gallery upon which Leonora's doorway gave, and even when she had the worst of her headaches she liked to have her door open, I suppose so that she might hear the approaching footsteps of ruin and disaster. At any rate, she hated to be in a room with a shut door. At that moment Leonora hated Edward with a hatred that was like hell, and she would have liked to bring her riding whip down across the girl's face. What right had Nancy to be young and slender and dark, gay at times mournful? What right had she to be exactly the woman to make Leonora's husband happy? For Leonora knew that Nancy would have made Edward happy. Yes, Leonora wished to bring her riding whip down on Nancy's young face. She imagined the pleasure she would feel when the lash fell across those queer features, the plea she would feel at drawing the handle at the same moment toward her, so as to cut deep into the flesh and to leave a lasting weal. Well, she left a lasting weal, and her words cut deeply into the girl's mind. They neither of them spoke about that again. A fortnight went by, a fortnight of deep rains, of heavy fields, of bad scent. Leonora's headaches seemed to have gone for good. She hunted once or twice, letting herself be piloted by him, whilst Edward looked after the girl. Then one evening, when those three were dining alone, Edward said in the queer, deliberate, heavy tones that came out of him in those days. He was looking at the table. "I have been thinking that Nancy ought to do more for her father. He is getting an old man. I have written to Colonel Rufford, suggesting that she should go to him." Leonora called out, "How dare you? How dare you?" The girl put her hand over her heart and cried out, "Oh, my sweet Saviour, help me." That was the queer way she thought within her mind, and the words forced themselves to her lips. Edward said nothing. And that night, by a merciless trick of the devil that pays attention to this sweltering hell of ours, Nancy Rufford had a letter from her mother. It came whilst Leonora was talking to Edward. Leonora would have intercepted as she had intercepted others. It was an amazing and horrible letter. I don't know what it contained. I just average out from its effects on Nancy that her mother, having eloped with some worthless sort of fellow, had done what is called sinking lower and lower. Whether she was actually on the streets I do not know, but I rather think that she eked out a small allowance that she had from her husband by the means of livelihood, and I think that she stated as much in her letter to Nancy and upbraided the girl for living in luxury whilst her mother starved. And it must have been horrible in tone, for Mrs. Rufford was a cruel sort of woman at the best of times. It must have seemed to that poor girl, opening her letter for distraction from another grief, but in her bedroom, like the laughter of a devil. I just cannot bear to think of my poor dear girl at that moment. And at the same time Leonora was lashing like a cold fiend into the unfortunate Edward. Or perhaps he was not so unfortunate because he had done what he knew to be the right thing. He may be deemed happy. I leave it to you. At any rate, he was sitting in his deep chair, and Leonora came into his room. For the first time in 9 years, she said, "This is the most atrocious thing you have done in your atrocious life." He never moved, and he never looked at her. God knows what was in Leonora's mind exactly. I like to think that uppermost in it was concern and horror at the thought of the poor girl's going back to a father whose voice made her shriek in the night. And indeed that motive was very strong with Leonora. But I think there was also present the thought that she wanted to go on torturing Edward with the girl's presence. She was, at the time, capable of that. Edward was sunk in his chair. There were in the room 2 candles, hidden by green glass shades. The green shades were reflected in the glasses of the bookcase, that contained not books but guns, with gleaming brown barrels and fishing rods and green baize over covers. There was dimly to be seen above the mantelpiece, encumbered with spurs, hooves, and bronze models of horses, a dark brown picture of a white horse. "If you think," Leonora said, "that I do not know that you are in love with the girl—" She began spiritedly, but she could not find any ending for the sentence. Edward did not stir. He never spoke. And then Leonora said, "If you want me to divorce you, I will. You can marry her. She's in love with you." He groaned at that a little, Leonora said. Then she went away. Heaven knows what happened in Leonora after that. She certainly does not herself know. She probably said a good deal more to Edward than I have been able to report. But that is all that she has told me, and I am not going to make up speeches. To follow her psychological development of that moment, I think we must allow that she upbraided him for a great deal of their past life whilst Edward sat absolutely silent. And indeed, in speaking of it afterwards, she has said several times, "I said a great deal more to him than I wanted to, just because he was so silent." She talked, in fact, in the endeavour to sting him into speech. She must have said so much that, with the expression of her grievance, her mood changed. She went back to her own room in the gallery and sat there for a long time thinking. And she thought herself into a mood of absolute unselfishness, of absolute self-contempt too. She said to herself that she was no good, that she had failed in all her efforts, in her efforts to get Edward back as in her efforts to make him curb his expenditure. She imagined herself to be exhausted. She imagined herself to be done. Then a great fear came over her. She thought that Edward, after what she had said to him, must have committed suicide. She went out on to the gallery and listened. There was no sound in the house except the regular beat of the great clock in the hall. But even in her debased condition, she was not the person to hang about. She acted. She went straight to Edward's room, opened the door, and looked in. He was oiling the breech action of a gun. It was an unusual thing for him to do. At that time of night, in his evening clothes, it never occurred to her, nevertheless, that he was going to shoot himself with the implement. She knew that he was doing it just for occupation, to keep himself from thinking. He looked up when she opened the door, his face illuminated by the light cast upwards from the round orifice in the green candle shades. She said, "I don't imagine that I should find Nancy here." She thought that she owed that to him. He answered then, "I don't imagine that you did imagine it." Those were the only words he spoke that night. She went like a lame duck back through the long corridors. She stumbled over the familiar tiger skins in the dark hall. She could hardly drag one limb after the other. In the gallery she perceived that Nancy's door was half open and that there was light in the girl's room. A sudden madness possessed her, a desire for action, a thirst for self-explanation. The rooms all gave on to the gallery, Leonora's to the east, the girl's next, then Edward's. The sight of those 3 open doors, side by side, gaping to receive whom the chances of the black night might bring, made Leonora shudder all over her body. She went into Nancy's room. The girl was sitting perfectly still in an armchair, very upright, as she had been taught to sit at the convent. She appeared to be as calm as a church. Her hair fell black and like a pall down over both her shoulders. The fire beside her was burning brightly. She must have just put the coals on. She was in a white silk kimono that covered her to her feet. The clothes that she had taken off were exactly folded upon the proper seats. Her long hands were one upon each arm of the chair that had a pink and white chintz back. Leonora told me these things. She seemed to think it extraordinary that the girl could have done such orderly things as fold up the clothes she had taken off upon such a night. when Edward had announced that he was going to send her to her father, and when, from her mother, she had received that letter. The letter, in its envelope, was in her right hand. Leonora did not at first perceive it. She said, "What are you doing so late?" The girl answered, "Just thinking." They seemed to think in whispers and speak below their breath. Then Leonora's eyes fell on the envelope and she recognized Mrs. Rufford's handwriting. It was one of those moments when thinking was impossible, Leonora said. It was as if stones were being thrown at her from every direction and she could only run. She heard herself exclaim, "Edward's dying because of you. He's dying. He's worth more than either of us." The girl looked past her at the panels of the half-closed door. "My poor father," she said. "My poor father." "You must stay here," Leonora answered fiercely. "You must stay here. I tell you, you must stay here." "I'm going to Glasgow," Nancy answered. "I shall go to Glasgow tomorrow morning. My mother is in Glasgow." It appears that it was in Glasgow that Mrs. Rufford pursued her disorderly life. She had selected that city not because it was more profitable, but because it was the natal home of her husband, to whom she desired to cause as much pain as possible. "You must stay here," Leonora began, "to save Edward. He's dying for love of you." The girl turned her calm eyes upon Leonora. "I know it," she said, "and I am dying for love of him." Leonora uttered an "ah" that, in spite of herself, was an "ah" of horror and of grief. "That is why," the girl continued, "I am going to Glasgow, to take my mother away from there," she added, "to the ends of the earth." For if the last month had made her nature that of a woman, her phrases were still romantically those of a schoolgirl. It was as if she had grown up so quickly that there had not been time to put her hair up. But she added, "We're no good, my mother and I." Leonora said with her fierce calmness, "No, no, you're not no good. It's that I'm no good. You can't let that man go on to ruin for want of you. You must belong to him." The girl, she said, smiled at her with a queer, faraway smile, as if she were 1,000 years old, as if Leonora were a tiny child. "I knew you would come to that," she said very slowly. "But we are not worth it, Edward and I." End of Part 4, Chapter 2.
Section 17 of The Good Soldier, A Tale of Passion. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by James O'Connor. The Good Soldier, A Tale of Passion by Ford Madox Ford. Part 4, Chapter 3. Nancy had, in fact, been thinking ever since Leonora had made that comment over the giving of the horse to young Selmes. She had been thinking and thinking, because she had had to sit for many days silent beside her aunt's bed. She had always thought of Leonora as her aunt, and she had had to sit thinking during many silent meals with Edward. And then, at times, with his bloodshot eyes and creased, heavy mouth, he would smile at her. And gradually the knowledge had come to her that Edward did not love Leonora and that Leonora hated Edward. Several things contributed to form and to harden this conviction. She was allowed to read the papers in those days. Or rather, since Leonora was always on her bed and Edward breakfasted alone and went out early over the estate, she was left alone with the papers. One day, in the paper, she saw the portrait of a woman she knew very well. Beneath it she read the words, "The Honorable Mrs. Brand, plaintiff in the remarkable divorce case reported on page 8." Nancy hardly knew what a divorce case was. She had been so remarkably well brought up, and Roman Catholics do not practice divorce. I don't know how Leonora had done it exactly. I suppose she had always impressed it on Nancy's mind that nice women did not read these things, and that would have been enough to make Nancy skip those pages. She read at any rate the account of the Brand divorce case, principally because she wanted to tell Leonora about it. She imagined that Leonora, when her headache left her, would like to know what was happening to Mrs Brand, who lived at Christchurch and whom they both liked very well. The case occupied 3 days, and the report that Nancy first came upon was that of the third day. Edward, however, kept the papers of the week, after his methodical fashion, in a rack in his gun-room, and when she had finished her breakfast Nancy went to that quiet apartment and had what she would have called a good read. It seemed to her to be a queer affair. She could not understand why one counsel should be so anxious to know all about the movements of Mr Brand upon a certain day. She could not understand why a chart of the bedroom accommodation at Christchurch Old Hall should be produced in court. She did not even see why they should want to know that, upon a certain occasion, the drawing-room door was locked. It made her laugh. It appeared to be all so senseless that grown people should occupy themselves with such matters. It struck her nevertheless as odd that one of the counsel should cross-question Mr Brand so insistently and so impertinently as to his feelings for Miss Lupton. Nancy knew Miss Lupton of Ringwood very well, a jolly girl, who rode a horse with 2 white fetlocks. Mr Brand persisted that he did not love Miss Lupton. Well, of course he did not love Miss Lupton. He was a married man. You might as well think of Uncle Edward loving anybody but Leonora. When people were married there was an end of loving. There were, no doubt, people who misbehaved, but they were poor people, or people not like those she knew. So these matters presented themselves to Nancy's mind. But later on in the case she found that Mr Brand had to confess to a guilty intimacy with someone or another. Nancy imagined that he must have been telling someone his wife's secrets. She could not understand why that was a serious offence. Of course it was not very gentlemanly. It lessened her opinion of Mrs Brand, but since she found that Mrs Brand had condoned that offence, she imagined that they could not have been very serious secrets that Mr Brand had told. And then, suddenly, it was forced on her conviction that Mr Brand, the mild Mr Brand that she had seen a month or 2 before their departure to Nauheim, playing blind man's buff with his children and kissing his wife when he caught her, Mr Brand and Mrs Brand had been on the worst possible terms. That was incredible. Yet there it was, in black and white. Mr Brand drank. Mr Brand had struck Mrs Brand to the ground when he was drunk. Mr Brand was adjudged in 2 or 3 abrupt words at the end of columns and columns of paper to have been guilty of cruelty to his wife and to have committed adultery with Miss Lupton. The last words conveyed nothing to Nancy, nothing real, that is to say. She knew that one was commanded not to commit adultery, but why, she thought, should one? It was probably something like catching salmon out of season, a thing one did not do. She gathered it had something to do with kissing or holding someone in your arms. And yet the whole effect of that reading upon Nancy was mysterious, terrifying, and evil. She felt a sickness that grew as she read. Her heart beat painfully. She began to cry. She asked God how He could permit such things to be. And she was more certain that Edward did not love Leonora and that Leonora hated Edward. Perhaps then Edward loved someone else. It was unthinkable. If he could love someone else than Leonora, her fierce unknown heart suddenly spoke in her side. Why could it not be herself? And he did not love her. This had occurred about a month before she got the letter from her mother. She let the matter rest until the sick feeling went off. It did that in a day or two. Then, finding that Leonora's headaches had gone, she suddenly told Leonora that Mrs Brand had divorced her husband. She asked what exactly it all meant. Leonora was lying on the sofa in the hall. She was feeling so weak that she could hardly find the words. She answered just: "It means that Mr Brand will be able to marry again." Nancy said: "But," and then, "he will be able to marry Miss Lupton?" Leonora just moved a hand in assent. Her eyes were shut. "Then," Nancy began. Her blue eyes were full of horror. Her brows were tight above them. The lines of pain about her mouth were very distinct. In her eyes the whole of that familiar great hall had a changed aspect. The andirons with the brass flowers at the ends appeared unreal. The burning logs were just logs that were burning, and not the comfortable symbols of an indestructible mode of life. The flame fluttered before the high fireback. The St Bernard sighed in his sleep. Outside the winter rain fell and fell. And suddenly she thought that Edward might marry someone else, and she nearly screamed. Leonora opened her eyes, lying sideways with her face upon the black and gold pillow of the sofa that was drawn half across the great fireplace. "I thought," Nancy said, "I never imagined. Aren't marriages sacraments? Aren't they indissoluble? I thought you were married and—" She was sobbing. "I thought you were married or not married as you are alive or dead." "That," Leonora said, "is the law of the Church. It is not the law of the land." "Oh yes," Nancy said, "the Brands are Protestants." She felt a sudden safeness descend upon her, and for an hour or so her mind was at rest. It seemed to her idiotic not to have remembered Henry VIII and the basis upon which Protestantism rests. She almost laughed at herself. The long afternoon wore on. The flames still fluttered when the maid made up the fire. The St Bernard awoke and lolloped away towards the kitchen, and then Leonora opened her eyes and said almost coldly: "And you? Don't you think you will get married?" It was so unlike Leonora that, for the moment, the girl was frightened in the dusk. But then, again, it seemed a perfectly reasonable question. "I don't know," she answered. "I don't know that anyone wants to marry me." "Several people want to marry you," Leonora said. "But I don't want to marry," Nancy answered. "I should like to go on living with you and Edward. I don't think I am in the way, or that I am really an expense. If I went you would have to have a companion, or perhaps I ought to earn my living." "I wasn't thinking of that," Leonora answered in the same dull tone. "You will have money enough from your father. But most people want to be married." I believe that she then asked the girl if she would not like to marry me, and that Nancy answered that she would marry me if she were told to, but that she wanted to go on living there. She added: "If I married anyone, I should want him to be like Edward." She was frightened out of her life. Leonora writhed on her couch and called out: "Oh God!" Nancy ran for the maid, for tablets of aspirin, for wet handkerchiefs. It never occurred to her that Leonora's expression of agony was for anything else than physical pain. You are to remember that all this happened a month before Leonora went into the girl's room at night. I have been casting back again, but I cannot help it. It is so difficult to keep all these people going. I tell you about Leonora and bring her up to date, then about Edward, who has fallen behind, and then the girl gets hopelessly left behind. I wish I could put it down in diary form. Thus, on the 1st of September they returned from Nauheim. Leonora at once took to her bed. By the 1st of October they were all going to meets together. Nancy had already observed very fully that Edward was strange in his manner. About the 6th of that month Edward gave the horse to young Selmes, and Nancy had cause to believe that her aunt did not love her uncle. On the 20th she read the account of the divorce case, which is reported in the papers of the 18th and the 2 following days. On the 23rd she had the conversation with her aunt in the hall, about marriage in general and about her own possible marriage. Her aunt's coming to her bedroom did not occur until the 12th of November. Thus she had 3 weeks for introspection beneath gloomy skies in that old house, rendered darker by the fact that it lay in a hollow crowned by fir trees with their black shadows. It was not a good situation for a girl. She began thinking about love, she who had never before considered it as anything other than a rather humorous, rather nonsensical matter. She remembered chance passages in chance books, things that had not really affected her at all at the time. She remembered someone's love for the Princess Badroulbadour. She remembered to have heard that love was a flame, a thirst, a withering up of the vitals, though she did not know what the vitals were. She had a vague recollection that love was said to render a hopeless lover's eyes hopeless. She remembered a character in a book who was said to have taken to drink through love. She remembered that lovers' existences were said to be punctuated with heavy sighs. Once she went to the little cottage piano that was in the corner of the hall and began to play. It was a tinkly, reedy instrument, for none of that household had any turn for music. Nancy herself could play a few simple songs, and she found herself playing. She had been sitting on the window seat looking out on the fading day. Leonora had gone to pay some calls. Edward was looking after some planting up in the new spinney. Thus she found herself playing on the old piano. She did not know how she came to be doing it. A silly, lilting, wavering tune came from before her in the dusk, a tune in which major notes with their cheerful insistence wavered and melted into minor sounds, as beneath a bridge the high lights on dark waters melt and waver and disappear into black depths. Well, it was a silly old tune. It goes with the words. They are about a willow tree, I think. Thou art to all lost loves the best, the only true plant found. That sort of thing. It is Herrick, I believe, and the music with the reedy, irregular, lilting sound that goes with Herrick. And it was dusk. The heavy hewn, dark pillars that supported the gallery were like mourning presences. The fire had sunk to nothing, a mere glow amongst white ashes. It was a sentimental sort of place and light and hour. And suddenly Nancy found that she was crying. She was crying quietly. She went on to cry with long, convulsive sobs. It seemed to her that everything gay, everything charming, all light, all sweetness had gone out of life. Unhappiness, unhappiness, unhappiness was all around her. She seemed to know no happy being, and she herself was agonizing. She remembered that Edward's eyes were hopeless. She was certain that he was drinking too much. At times he sighed deeply. He appeared as a man who was burning with inward flame, drying up the soul with thirst, withering up in the vitals. Then the torturing conviction came to her, the conviction that had visited her again and again, that Edward must love someone other than Leonora. With her little pedagogic sectarianism she remembered that Catholics do not do this thing. But Edward was a Protestant. Then Edward loved somebody. And after that thought her eyes grew hopeless. She sighed as the old St. Bernard beside her did. At meals she would feel an intolerable desire to drink a glass of wine, and then another, and then a third. Then she would find herself grow gay. But in half an hour the gaiety went. She felt like a person who was burning up with an inward flame, desiccating at the soul with thirst, withering up in the vitals. One evening she went into Edward's gun room. He had gone to a meeting of the National Reserve Committee. On the table beside his chair was a decanter of whisky. She poured out a wine glass full and drank it off. Flame then really seemed to fill her body. Her legs swelled, her face grew feverish. She dragged her tall height up to her room and lay in the dark. The bed reeled beneath her. She gave way to the thought that she was in Edward's arms, and that he was kissing her on her face that burned, on her shoulders that burned, and on her neck that was on fire. She never touched alcohol again. Not once after that did she have such thoughts. They died out of her mind. They left only a feeling of shame so insupportable that her brain could not take it in, and they vanished. She imagined that her anguish at the thought of Edward's love for another person was solely sympathy for Leonora. She determined that the rest of her life must be spent in acting as Leonora's handmaiden, sweeping, tending, embroidering, like some Deborah, some mediaeval saint. I am not, unfortunately, up in the Catholic hagiology, but I know that she pictured herself as some personage with a depressed, earnest face and tightly closed lips, in a clear white room, watering flowers or tending an embroidery frame. Or she desired to go with Edward to Africa and to throw herself in the path of a charging lion, so that Edward might be saved for Leonora at the cost of her life. Well, along with her sad thoughts she had her childish ones. She knew nothing of life, except that one must live sadly. That she now knew. What happened to her on the night when she received at once the blow that Edward wished her to go to her father in India, and the blow of the letter from her mother was this: she called first upon her sweet Saviour, and she thought of our Lord as her sweet Saviour, that He might make it impossible that she should go to India. Then she realized from Edward's demeanour that he was determined that she should go to India. It must then be right that she should go. Edward was always right in his determinations. He was the Cid. He was the Lohengrin. He was the Chevalier Bayard. Nevertheless, her mind mutinied and revolted. She could not leave that house. She imagined that he wished her gone that she might not witness his amours with another girl. Well, she was prepared to tell him that she was ready to witness his amours with another young girl. She would stay there to comfort Leonora. Then came the desperate shock of the letter from her mother. Her mother said, I believe, something like: "You have no right to go on living your life of prosperity and respect. You ought to be on the streets with me. How do you know that you are even Colonel Rutherford's daughter?" She did not know what these words meant. She thought of her mother as sleeping beneath the arches whilst the snow fell. That was the impression conveyed to her mind by the words "on the streets." A platonic sense of duty gave her the idea that she ought to go to comfort her mother, the mother that bore her, though she hardly knew what the words meant. At the same time she knew that her mother had left her father with another man. Therefore she pitied her father and thought it terrible in herself that she trembled at the sound of her father's voice. If her mother was that sort of woman it was natural that her father should have had accesses of madness in which he had struck herself to the ground. and the voice of her conscience said to her that her first duty was to her parents. It was in accord with this awakened sense of duty that she undressed with great care and meticulously folded the clothes that she took off. Sometimes, but not very often, she threw them helter-skelter about the room. And that sense of duty was her prevailing mood when Leonora, tall, clean-run, golden-haired, all in black, appeared in her doorway and told her that Edward was dying of love for her. She knew then with her conscious mind what she had known within herself for months, that Edward was dying, actually and physically dying, of love for her. It seemed to her that for one short moment her spirit could say, Domine nunc dimittis. Lord, now lettest thou thy servant depart in peace. She imagined that she could cheerfully go away to Glasgow and rescue her fallen mother. End of Part 4, Chapter 3. Recording by James O'Connor. Randolph, Massachusetts. November 2009. Of the Good Soldier, A Tale of Passion. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by James O'Connor. The Good Soldier, A Tale of Passion by Ford Madox Ford. Part 4, Chapter 4. And it seemed to her to be in tune with the mood, with the hour and with the woman in front of her, to say that she knew Edward was dying of love for her, and that she was dying of love for Edward. For that fact had suddenly slipped into place and become real for her as the niched marker on a whist tablet slips round with the pressure of your thumb. That rubber at least was made. And suddenly Leonora seemed to have become different, and she seemed to have become different in her attitude towards Leonora. It was as if she, in her frail, white silken kimono, sat beside her fire, but upon a throne. It was as if Leonora, in her close dress of black lace, with the gleaming white shoulders and the coiled yellow hair that the girl had always considered the most beautiful thing in the world, it was as if Leonora had become pinched, shriveled, blue with cold, shivering, suppliant. Yet Leonora was commanding her. It was no good commanding her. She was going on the morrow to her mother, who was in Glasgow. Leonora went on saying that she must stay there to save Edward, who was dying of love for her. And, proud and happy in the thought that Edward loved her and that she loved him, she did not even listen to what Leonora said. It appeared to her that it was Leonora's business to save her husband's body. She, Nancy, possessed his soul, a precious thing that she would shield and bear away up in her arms, as if Leonora were a hungry dog, trying to spring up at a lamb that she was carrying. Yes, she felt as if Edward's love were a precious lamb that she were bearing away from a cruel and predatory beast. For at that time Leonora appeared to her as a cruel and predatory beast. Leonora with her hunger, with her cruelty, had driven Edward to madness. He must be sheltered by his love for her and by her love from a great distance and unspoken, enveloping him, surrounding him, upholding him, by her voice speaking from Glasgow, saying that she loved, that she adored, that she passed no moment without longing, loving, quivering at the thought of him. Leonora said loudly, insistently, with a bitterly imperative tone, "You must stay here. You must belong to Edward. I will divorce him." The girl answered, "The Church does not allow of divorce. I cannot belong to your husband. I am going to Glasgow to rescue my mother." The half-opened door opened noiselessly to the full. Edward was there. His devouring, doomed eyes were fixed on the girl's face. His shoulders slouched forward. He was undoubtedly half drunk, and he had the whisky decanter in one hand, a slanting candlestick in the other. He said with a heavy ferocity to Nancy, "I forbid you to talk about these things. You are to stay here until I hear from your father. Then you will go to your father." The two women, looking at each other like beasts about to spring, hardly gave a glance to him. He leaned against the doorpost. He said again, "Nancy, I forbid you to talk about these things. I am the master of this house." And at the sound of his voice, heavy, male, coming from a deep chest, in the night with the blackness behind him, Nancy felt as if her spirit bowed before him with folded hands. She felt that she would go to India and that she desired never again to talk of these things. Leonora said, "You see that it is your duty to belong to him. He must not be allowed to go on drinking." Nancy did not answer. Edward was gone. They heard him slipping and shambling on the polished oak of the stairs. Nancy screamed when there came the sound of a heavy fall. Leonora said again, "You see." The sounds went on from the hall below. The light of the candle Edward held flickered up between the handrails of the gallery. Then they heard his voice. "Give me Glasgow. Glasgow in Scotland. I want the number of a man called White, of Simrock Park, Glasgow. Edward White, Simrock Park, Glasgow. 10 minutes? At this time of night?" His voice was quite level, normal, and patient. Alcohol took him in the legs, not the speech. "I can wait." His voice came again. "Yes, I know they have a number. I have been in communication with them before." "He is going to telephone to your mother," Leonora said. "He will make it all right for her." She got up and closed the door. She came back to the fire and added bitterly, "He can always make it all right for everybody except me. Excepting me." The girl said nothing. She sat there in a blissful dream. She seemed to see her lover sitting as he always sat, in a round back chair in the dark hall, sitting low with the receiver at his ear, talking in a gentle, slow voice that he reserved for the telephone, and saving the world and her in the black darkness. She moved her hand over the bareness of the base of her throat, to have the warmth of flesh upon it and upon her bosom. She said nothing. Leonora went on talking. God knows what Leonora said. She repeated that the girl must belong to her husband. She said that she used that phrase because, though she might have a divorce, or even a dissolution of the marriage by the Church, it would still be adultery that the girl and Edward would be committing. But she said that that was necessary. It was the price that the girl must pay for the sin of having made Edward love her, for the sin of loving her husband. She talked on beside the fire. The girl must become an adulteress. She had wronged Edward by being so beautiful, so gracious, so good. It was sinful to be so good. She must pay the price so as to save the man she had wronged. In between her pauses the girl could hear the voice of Edward, droning on indistinguishably, with jerky pauses for replies. It made her glow with pride. The man she loved was working for her. He at least was resolved, was malely determined, knew the right thing. Leonora talked on with her eyes boring into Nancy's. The girl hardly looked at her and hardly heard her. After a long time Nancy said, after hours and hours. "I shall go to India as soon as Edward hears from my father. I cannot talk about these things, because Edward does not wish it." At that Leonora screamed out and wavered swiftly towards the closed door, and Nancy found that she was springing out of her chair with her white arms stretched wide. She was clasping the other woman to her breast. She was saying, "Oh, my poor dear! Oh, my poor dear!" And they sat crouching together in each other's arms, and crying and crying. And they lay down in the same bed, talking and talking, all through the night. And all through the night Edward could hear their voices through the wall. That was how it went. Next morning they were all three as if nothing had happened. Towards 11 Edward came to Nancy, who was arranging some Christmas roses in a silver bowl. He put a telegram beside her on the table. "You can uncode it for yourself," he said. Then, as he went out of the door, he said, "You can tell your aunt I have cabled to Mr Dowell to come over. He will make things easier till you leave." The telegram, when it was uncoded, read, as far as I can remember, "Will take Mrs Rutherford to Italy. Undertake to do this for certain. Am devotedly attached to Mrs Rutherford. Have no need of financial assistance. Did not know there was a daughter, and am much obliged to you for pointing out my duty. White." It was something like that. Then the household resumed its wonted course of days until my arrival. End of Part 4, Chapter 4. Recording by James O'Connor. Randolph, Massachusetts, November, 2009.
Section 19 of The Good Soldier, A Tale of Passion. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Greg Higgins. The Good Soldier, A Tale of Passion by Madox Ford. Part 4, Section 5. It is this part of the story that makes me saddest of all. For I ask myself unceasingly, my mind going round and round in a worried, baffled space of pain, what should these people have done? What, in the name of God, should they have done? The end was perfectly plain to each of them. It was perfectly manifest at that stage that if the girl did not, in Leonora's phrase, belong to Edward, Edward must die. The girl must lose her reason because Edward died. And that after a time Leonora, who was the coldest and the strongest of the three, would console herself by marrying Rodney Bayham and have a quiet, comfortable, good time. That end on that night, whilst Leonora sat in the girl's bedroom and Edward telephoned down below, that end was plainly manifest. The girl plainly was half mad already. Edward was half dead. Only Leonora, active, persistent instinct with her cold passion of energy, was doing things. What then should they have done? It worked out in the extinction of two very splendid personalities, for Edward and the girl were splendid personalities, in order that a third personality, more normal, should have, after a long period of trouble, a quiet, comfortable, good time. I am writing this now, I should say, a full 18 months after the words that end my last chapter. Since writing the words, "until my arrival," which I see end that paragraph, I have seen again for a glimpse, from a swift train, Beaucaire with the beautiful white tower, Tarascon with the white square castle, the great Rhone, the immense stretches of the Crau. I have rushed through all Provence, and all Provence no longer matters. It is no longer in the olive hills that I shall find my heaven, because there is only hell. Edward is dead. The girl is gone. Oh, utterly gone. Leonora is having her good time with Rodney Bayham, and I sit alone in Branshaw Teleragh. I have been through Provence. I have seen Africa. I have visited Asia to see, in Ceylon, in a darkened room, my poor girl sitting motionless, with her wonderful hair about her, looking at me with eyes that did not see, and saying distinctly, "Credo in unum Deum omnipotentem. Credo in unum Deum omnipotentem." Those are the only reasonable words she uttered. Those are the only words it appears that she ever will utter. I suppose they are reasonable words. It must be extraordinarily reasonable for her, if she can say that she believes in an omnipotent deity. Well, there it is. I am very tired of it all. For I dare say, all this may sound romantic, but it is tiring, tiring to have been in the midst of it, to have taken the tickets, to have caught the trains, to have chosen the cabins, to have consulted the purser and the stewards as to diet for the quiescent patient who did nothing but announce her belief in an omnipotent deity. That may sound romantic, but it is just a record of fatigue. I don't know why I should always be selected to be serviceable. I don't resent it, but I've never been the least good. Florence selected me for her own purposes, and I was no good to her. Edward called me to come and have a chat with him, and I couldn't stop him cutting his throat. Then one day, 18 months ago, I was quietly writing in my room at Branshaw, when Leonora came to me with a letter. It was a very pathetic letter from Colonel Rufford about Nancy. Colonel Rufford had left the army and had taken up an appointment at a tea-planting estate in Ceylon. His letter was pathetic because it was so brief, so inarticulate, and so businesslike. He had gone down to the boat to meet his daughter, and had found his daughter quite mad. It appears that at Aden, Nancy had seen in a local paper the news of Edward's suicide. In the Red Sea she had gone mad. She had remarked to Mrs. Colonel Luton, who was chaperoning her, that she believed in an omnipotent deity. She hadn't made any fuss. Her eyes were quite dry and glassy. Even when she was mad, Nancy could behave herself. Colonel Rufford said the doctor did not anticipate that there was any chance of his child's recovery. It was nevertheless possible that if she could meet someone from Branshaw, it might soothe her, and it might have a good effect. And he just simply wrote to Leonora, "Please come and see if you can do it." I seem to have lost all sense of the pathetic, but still that simple, enormous request of the old colonel strikes me as pathetic. He was cursed by his atrocious temper. He had been cursed by a half-mad wife who drank and went on the streets. His daughter was totally mad, and yet he believed in the goodness of human nature. He believed that Leonora would take the trouble to go all the way to Ceylon in order to soothe his daughter. Leonora wouldn't. Leonora didn't ever want to see Nancy again. I dare say that, in the circumstances, was natural enough. At the same time she agreed, as it were on public grounds, that someone soothing ought to go from Branshaw to Ceylon. She sent me and her old nurse, who had looked after Nancy from the time when the girl, a child of 13, had first come to Branshaw. So off I go, rushing through Provence to catch the steamer at Marseille, and I wasn't the least good when I got to Ceylon, and the nurse wasn't the least good. Nothing has been the least good. The doctors said at Kandy that if Nancy could be brought to England, the sea air, the change of climate, the voyage, and all the usual sort of things might restore her reason. Of course they haven't restored her reason. She is, I am aware, sitting in the hall, 40 paces from where I am now writing. I don't want to be in the least romantic about it. She is very well dressed. She is quite quiet, and she is very beautiful. The old nurse looks after her very efficiently. Of course you have the makings of a situation here, but it is all very humdrum as far as I am concerned. I should marry Nancy if her reason were ever sufficiently restored to let her appreciate the meaning of the Anglican marriage service, but it is probable that her reason will never be sufficiently restored to let her appreciate the meaning of the Anglican marriage service. Therefore I cannot marry her, according to the law of the land. So here I am very much where I started 13 years ago. I am the attendant, not the husband, of a beautiful girl who pays no attention to me. I am estranged from Leonora, who married Rodney Bayham in my absence and went to live at Bayham. Leonora rather dislikes me because she has got it into her head that I disapprove of her marriage with Rodney Bayham. Well, I disapprove of her marriage. Possibly I'm jealous. Yes, no doubt I am jealous. In my fainter sort of way I seem to perceive myself following the lines of Edward Ashburnham. I suppose I should really like to be a polygamist, with Nancy, and with Leonora, and with Maisie Maidan, and possibly even Florence. I am no doubt like every other man, only probably because of my American origin I am fainter. At the same time I am able to assure you that I am a strictly respectable person. I have never done anything that the most anxious mother of a daughter, or the most careful dean of a cathedral would object to. I have only followed faintly and in my unconscious desires Edward Ashburnham. Well, it is all over. Not one of us has got what he really wanted. Leonora wanted Edward, and she got Rodney Bayham. A pleasant enough sort of sheep. Florence wanted Branshaw, and it is I who have bought it from Leonora. I didn't really want it. What I wanted mostly was to cease being a nurse attendant. Well, I am a nurse attendant. Edward wanted Nancy Rufford, and I have got her. Only she is mad. It is a queer and fantastic world. Why can't people have what they want? The things were all there to content everybody, yet everybody has the wrong thing. Perhaps you can make head or tail of it. It is beyond me. Is there any terrestrial paradise where amidst the whispering of the olive leaves people can be with whom they like, and have what they like, and take their ease in shadows and in coolness? Or are all men's lives like the lives of us good people, like the lives of the Ashburnhams, of the Dowells, of the Ruffords, broken, tumultuous, agonized, and unromantic lives, periods punctuated by screams, by imbecilities, by deaths, by agonies? Who the devil knows? For there was a great deal of imbecility about the closing scenes of the Ashburnham tragedy. Neither of those two women knew what they wanted. It was only Edward who took a perfectly clear line, and he was drunk most of the time. But drunk or sober, he stuck to what was demanded by convention and by the traditions of his house. Nancy Rufford had to be exported to India, and Nancy Rufford hadn't to hear a word of love from him. She was exported to India, and she never heard a word from Edward Ashburnham. It was a conventional line. It was in tune with the tradition of Edward's house. I dare say it worked out for the greatest good of the body politic. Conventions and traditions, I suppose, work blindly, but surely for the preservation of the normal type, for the extinction of proud, resolute, and unusual individuals. Edward was the normal man, but there was too much of the sentimentalist about him, and society does not need too many sentimentalists. Nancy was a splendid creature, but she had about her a touch of madness. Society does not need individuals with touches of madness about them. So Edward and Nancy found themselves steamrolled out, and Leonora survives the perfectly normal type, married to a man who is rather like a rabbit. For Rodney Bayham is rather like a rabbit, and I hear that Leonora is expected to have a baby in 3 months' time. So those splendid and tumultuous creatures with their magnetism and their passions, those two that I really loved, have gone from this earth. It is no doubt best for them. What would Nancy have made of Edward if she had succeeded in living with him? What would Edward have made of her? For there was about Nancy a touch of cruelty, a touch of definite, actual cruelty, that made her desire to see people suffer. Yes, she desired to see Edward suffer, and by God she gave him hell. She gave him an unimaginable hell. Those two women pursued that poor devil and flayed the skin off him as if they had done it with whips. I tell you his mind bled almost visibly. I seemed to see him stand naked to the waist, his forearms shielding his eyes, and flesh hanging from him in rags. I tell you that is no exaggeration of what I feel. It was as if Leonora and Nancy banded themselves together to do execution for the sake of humanity upon the body of a man who was at their disposal. They were like a couple of Sioux who had got a hold of an Apache and had him well tied to a stake. I tell you there was no end to the tortures they inflicted upon him. Night after night he would hear them talking, maddened, sweating, seeking oblivion in drink. He would lie there and hear the voices going on, and day after day Leonora would come to him and would announce the result of their deliberations. They were like judges debating over the sentence upon a criminal. They were like ghouls with an immobile corpse in a tomb beside them. I don't think that Leonora was any more to blame than the girl, although Leonora was the more active of the two. Leonora, as I have said, was a perfectly normal woman. I mean to say that in normal circumstances her desires were those of the woman who is needed by society. She desired children, decorum, and establishment. She desired to avoid waste. She desired to keep up appearances. She was utterly and entirely normal, even in her utterly undeniable beauty. But I don't mean to say that she acted perfectly normally in this perfectly abnormal situation. All the world was mad around her, and she herself, agonized, took on the complexion of a madwoman, of a woman very wicked, of the villain of the piece. What would you have? Steel is a normal, hard-polished substance, but if you put it in a hot fire it will become red, soft, and not to be handled. If you put it in a fire still more hot, it will drip away. It was like that with Leonora. She was made for normal circumstances, for Mr. Rodney Bayham, who will keep a separate establishment secretly in Portsmouth, and make occasional trips to Paris and to Budapest. In the case of Edward and the girl, Leonora broke and simply went all over the place. She adopted unfamiliar and therefore extraordinary and ungraceful attitudes of mind. At one moment she was all for revenge. After haranguing the girl for hours through the night, she harangued for hours of the day the silent Edward. And Edward just once tripped up, and that was his undoing. Perhaps he had had too much whisky that afternoon. She asked him perpetually what he wanted. What did he want? What did he want? All he ever answered was, "I've told you." He meant that he wanted the girl to go to her father in India as soon as her father should cable that he was ready to receive her. But just once he tripped up. To Leonora's eternal question he answered that all he desired in life was that he could pick himself together again and go on with his daily occupations if, the girl being 5,000 miles away, would continue to love him. He wanted nothing more. He prayed his God for nothing more. Well, he was a sentimentalist. And the moment that she heard that, Leonora determined that the girl should not go 5,000 miles away and that she should not continue to love Edward. The way she worked it was this. She continued to tell the girl that she must belong to Edward. She was going to get a divorce. She was going to get a dissolution of marriage from Rome. But she considered it her duty to warn the girl of the sort of monster that Edward was. She told the girl of La Dolciquita, of Mrs. Basil, of Maisie Maidan, of Florence. She spoke of the agonies she had endured her life with the man who was violent, overbearing, vain, drunken, arrogant, and monstrously a prey to his sexual necessities. And at hearing of the miseries her aunt had suffered, for Leonora once more had the aspect of an aunt to the girl, with the swift cruelty of youth, with the swift solidarity that attaches woman to woman, the girl made her resolves. Her aunt said insistently, "You must save Edward's life. You must save his life. All that he needs is a little period of satisfaction from you. Then he will tire of you as he has of the others, but you must save his life." And all the while that wretched fellow knew, by a curious instinct that runs between human beings living together, exactly what was going on. And he remained dumb. He stretched out no finger to help himself. All that he required to keep himself a decent member of society was that the girl, 5,000 miles away, should continue to love him. They were putting a stopper upon that. I've told you that the girl came one night to his room, and that was the real hell for him. That was the picture that never left his imagination. The girl in the dim light, rising up at the foot of his bed. He said that it seemed to have a greenish sort of effect, as if there were a greenish tinge in the shadows of the tall bedposts that framed her body. And she looked at him with her straight eyes of an unflinching cruelty, and she said, "I am ready to belong to you. I am ready to belong to you, to save your life." He answered, "I don't want it. I don't want it. I don't want it." And he says that he didn't want it, that he should have hated himself, that it was unthinkable. And all the while he had the immense temptation to do the unthinkable thing, not from the physical desire, but because of a mental certitude. He was certain that if she had once submitted to him, she would remain his forever. He knew that. She was thinking that her aunt had said that he desired her to love him from a distance of 5,000 miles. She said, "I can never love you now. I know the kind of man you are. I will belong to you to save your life, but I can never love you." It was a fantastic display of cruelty. She didn't in the least know what it meant to belong to a man. But at that Edward pulled himself together. He spoke in his normal tones, gruff, husky, overbearing, as he would have done to a servant or to a horse. "Go back to your room. Go back to your room and go to sleep. This is all nonsense." They were baffled, those two women. And then I came on the scene. End of Part 4, Section 5. Recording by Greg Higgins. Of the Good Soldier, A Tale of Passion. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Greg Higgins. The Good Soldier, A Tale of Passion by Ford Madox Ford, Part 4, Section 6. My coming on the scene certainly calmed things down, for the whole fortnight that intervened between my arrival and the girl's departure. I don't mean to say that endless talking did not go on at night, or that Leonora did not send me out with the girl, and in the interval give Edward a hell of a time. Having discovered that he wanted, that the girl should go 5,000 miles away and love him steadfastly as people do in sentimental novels, she was determined to smash that aspiration, and she repeated to Edward in every possible tone that the girl did not love him, that the girl detested him for his brutality, his overbearingness, his drinking habits. She pointed out that Edward in the girl's eyes was already pledged 3 or 4 deep. He was pledged to Leonora herself, to Mrs Basil, and to memories of Maisie Maidan and to Florence. Edward never said anything. Did the girl love Edward or didn't she? I don't know. At that time I dare say she didn't, though she certainly had done so before Leonora had got to work upon his reputation. She certainly had loved him for what I will call the public side of his record, for his good soldiering, for his saving lives at sea, for the excellent landlord that he was and the good sportsman. But it is quite possible that all those things came to appear as nothing in her eyes when she discovered that he wasn't a good husband. For though women, as I see them, have little or no feeling of responsibility towards a county, or a country, or a career, although they may be entirely lacking in any kind of communal solidarity, they have an immense and automatically working instinct that attaches them to the interest of womanhood. It is of course possible for any woman to cut out and to carry off another woman's husband or lover, but I rather think that a woman will only do this if she has reason to believe that the other woman has given her husband a bad time. I am certain that if she thinks the man has been a brute to his wife, she will, with her instinctive feeling for suffering femininity, put him back, as the saying is. I don't attach any particular importance to these generalizations of mine. They may be right, they may be wrong. I am only an aging American with very little knowledge of life. You may take my generalizations or leave them, but I am pretty certain that I am right in the case of Nancy Rufford, that she had loved Edward Ashburnham very deeply and tenderly. It is nothing to the point that she let him have it good and strong as soon as she discovered that he had been unfaithful to Leonora, and that his public services had cost more than Leonora thought they ought to have cost. Nancy would be bound to let him have it good and strong then. She would owe that to feminine public opinion. She would be driven to it by the instinct for self-preservation, since she might well imagine that if Edward had been unfaithful to Leonora, to Mrs Basil, and to the memories of the other two, he might be unfaithful to herself. And no doubt she had her share of the sex instinct that makes women be intolerably cruel to the beloved person. Anyhow, I don't know whether at this point Nancy Rufford loved Edward Ashburnham. I don't know whether she even loved him when, on getting at Aidan the news of his suicide, she went mad, because that may just as well have been for the sake of Leonora as for the sake of Edward. Or it may have been for the sake of both of them. I don't know. I know nothing. I am very tired. Leonora held passionately the doctrine that the girl didn't love Edward. She wanted desperately to believe that. It was a doctrine as necessary to her existence as the belief in the personal immortality of the soul. She said that it was impossible that Nancy could have loved Edward after she had given the girl her view of Edward's career and character. Edward, on the other hand, believed maunderingly that some essential attractiveness in himself must have made the girl continue to go on loving him. To go on loving him, as it were, in underneath her official aspect of hatred. He thought she only pretended to hate him in order to save her face, and he thought that her quite atrocious telegram from Brindisi was only another attempt to do that, to prove that she had feelings credible to a member of the feminine commonweal. I don't know. I leave it to you. There is another point that worries me a good deal in the aspects of this sad affair. Leonora says that in desiring that the girl should go 5,000 miles away and yet continue to love him, Edward was a monster of selfishness. He was desiring the ruin of a young life. Edward, on the other hand, put it to me that, supposing that the girl's love was a necessity to his existence, and if he did nothing by word or by action to keep Nancy's love alive, he couldn't be called selfish. Leonora replied that showed he had an abominably selfish nature, even though his actions might be perfectly correct. I can't make out which of them was right. I leave it to you. It is at any rate certain that Edward's actions were monstrously, cruelly correct. He sat still and let Leonora take away his character, and let Leonora damn him to a deepest hell without stirring a finger. I dare say he was a fool. I don't see what object there was in letting the girl think worse of him than was necessary. Still, there it is. And there it is also that all those three presented to the world the spectacle of being the best of good people. I assure you that during my stay for that fortnight in that fine old house, I never so much as noticed a single thing that could have affected that good opinion. And even when I look back, knowing the circumstances, I can't remember a single thing that any of them said that could have betrayed them. I can't remember right up to the dinner, when Leonora read out that telegram. Not the tremor of an eyelash, not the shaking of a hand. It was just a pleasant country house party. And Leonora kept it up jolly well, for even longer than that. She kept it up as far as I was concerned until 8 days after Edward's funeral. Immediately after that particular dinner, the dinner at which I received the announcement that Nancy was going to leave for India on the following day, I asked Leonora to let me have a word with her. She took me into her little sitting room, and I then said, I spare you the record of my emotions, that she was aware that I wished to marry Nancy, that she had seemed to favour my suit, and that it appeared to be rather a waste of money upon tickets and rather a waste of time upon travel to let the girl go to India if Leonora thought that there was any chance of her marrying me. And Leonora, I assure you, was the absolutely perfect British matron. She said that she quite favoured my suit, that she could not desire for the girl a better husband, but that she considered that the girl ought to see a little more of life before taking such an important step. Yes, Leonora used the words, taking such an important step. She was perfect. Actually, I think she would have liked the girl to marry me enough. But my programme included the buying of the Kershaw's house about a mile away from the Fordingbridge Road and settling down there with the girl. That didn't at all suit Leonora. She didn't want to have the girl within a mile and a half of Edward for the rest of their lives. Still, I think she might have managed to let me know, in some periphrasis or other, that I might have the girl if I would take her to Philadelphia or Timbuktu. I loved Nancy very much, and Leonora knew it. However, I left it at that. I left it with the understanding that Nancy was going away to India on probation. It seemed to me a perfectly reasonable arrangement, and I am a reasonable sort of man. I simply said that I should follow Nancy out to India after 6 months' time or so, or perhaps after a year. Well, you see, I did follow Nancy out to India after a year. I must confess to having felt a little angry with Leonora for not having warned me earlier that the girl would be going. I took it as one of the queer, not very straight methods that Roman Catholics seem to adopt in dealing with matters of this world. I took it that Leonora had been afraid I should propose to the girl, or at any rate have made considerably greater advances to her than I did, if I had known earlier that she was going away so soon. Perhaps Leonora was right. Perhaps Roman Catholics with their queer, shifty ways are always right. They are dealing with the queer, shifty thing that is human nature. For it is quite possible that if I had known Nancy was going away so soon, I would have tried making love to her, and that would have produced another complication. It may have been just as well. It is queer the fantastic things that quite good people will do in order to keep up appearances of calm poco-curantism. For Edward Ashburnham and his wife called me half the world over in order to sit on the back seat of a dog-cart, whilst Edward drove the girl to the railway station from which she was to take her departure to India. They wanted, I suppose, to have a witness of the calmness of that function. The girl's luggage had been already packed and sent off before. Her berth on the steamer had been taken. They had timed it all so exactly that it went like clockwork. They had known the date upon which Colonel Rufford would get Edward's letter, and they had known almost exactly the hour at which they would receive his telegram asking his daughter to come to him. It had all been quite beautifully and quite mercilessly arranged by Edward himself. They gave Colonel Rufford as a reason for telegraphing the fact that Mrs. Colonel somebody or other would be travelling by that ship, and that she would serve as an efficient chaperone for the girl. It was a most amazing business. I think it would have been better in the eyes of God if they had all attempted to gouge out each other's eyes with carving knives. But they were good people. After my interview with Leonora, I went desultorily into Edward's gun-room. I didn't know where the girl was, and I thought I might find her there. I suppose I had a vague idea of proposing to her in spite of Leonora. So I presume. I don't come of quite such good people as the Ashburnhams. Edward was lounging in his chair smoking a cigar, and he said nothing for quite 5 minutes. The candles glowed in the green shades, the reflections were green in the glasses of the bookcases that held guns and fishing rods. Over the mantelpiece was the brownish picture of the white horse. Those were the quietest moments that I have ever known. Then suddenly Edward looked me straight in the eyes and said, "Look here, old man, I wish you would drive with Nancy and me to the station tomorrow." I said of course I would. I would drive with him and Nancy to the station on the morrow. He lay there for a long time, looking along the line of his knees at the fluttering fire, and then suddenly, in a perfectly calm voice, and without lifting his eyes, he said, "I am so desperately in love with Nancy Rufford that I am dying of it." Poor devil, he hadn't meant to speak of it, but I guess he just had to speak to somebody, and I appeared to be like a woman or a solicitor. He talked all night. Well, he carried out the programme to the last breath. It was a very clear winter morning with a good deal of frost in it. The sun was quite bright. The winding road between the heather and the bracken was very hard. I sat on the back seat of the dog-cart. Nancy was beside Edward. They talked about the way the cob went. Edward pointed out with a whip a cluster of deer upon a coombe 3/4 of a mile away. We passed the hounds in the level bit of road beside the high trees going into Fordingbridge, and Edward pulled up the dog-cart so that Nancy might say good-bye to the huntsman and cap him a last sovereign. She had ridden with those hounds ever since she had been 13. The train was 5 minutes late, and they imagined that was because it was market day at Swindon, or wherever the train came from. That was the sort of thing they talked about. The train came in. Edward found her a first-class carriage with an elderly woman in it. The girl entered the carriage. Edward closed the door, and then she put out her hand to shake mine. There was upon those people's faces no expression of any kind whatever. The signal for the train's departure was a very bright red. That is about as passionate a statement as I can get into that scene. She was not looking her best. She had on a cap of brown fur that did not very well match her hair. She said, "So long," to Edward. Edward answered, "So long." He swung around on his heel. In large slouching and walking with a heavy deliberate pace, he went out of the station. I followed him and got up beside him in the high dog-cart. It was the most horrible performance I have ever seen. And after that a holy peace, like the peace of God which passes all understanding, descended upon Branshaw Teleragh. Leonora went about her daily duties with a sort of triumphant smile, a very faint smile, but quite triumphant. I guess she had so long since given up any idea of getting her man back that it was enough for her to have that girl out of the house and well cured of her infatuation. Once in the hall, when Leonora was going out, Edward said beneath his breath that I just caught the words, "Thou hast conquered, O pale Galilean." It was like his sentimentality to quote Swinburne. But he was perfectly quiet, and he'd given up drinking. The only thing that he ever said to me after that drive to the station was, "It is very odd, I think I ought to tell you, Dowell, that I haven't any feelings at all about the girl, now it's all over. Don't you worry about me, I'm all right." A long time afterwards he said, "I guess it was only a flash in the pan." He began to look after the estates again. He took all that trouble over getting off the gardener's daughter who had murdered her baby. He shook hands smilingly with every farmer in the market-place. He addressed 2 political meetings. He hunted twice. Leonora made a frightful scene about spending £200 on getting the gardener's daughter acquitted. Everything went on as if the girl had never existed. It was very still weather. Well, that is the end of the story, and when I come to look at it I see that it is a happy ending with wedding bells and all. The villains, for obviously Edward and the girl were villains, have been punished by suicide and madness. Their heroine, the perfectly normal, virtuous and slightly deceitful heroine, has become the happy wife of a perfectly normal, virtuous and slightly deceitful husband. She will shortly become a mother of a perfectly normal, virtuous, slightly deceitful son or daughter. A happy ending, that is what it works out at. I cannot conceal from myself the fact that I now dislike Leonora. Without doubt I am jealous of Rodney Bayham. But I don't know whether it is merely a jealousy arising from the fact that I desired myself to possess Leonora, or whether it is because to her were sacrificed the only 2 persons that I have ever really loved, Edward Ashburnham and Nancy Rufford. In order to set her up in a modern mansion, replete with every convenience and dominated by a quite respectable and eminently economical master of the house, it was necessary that Edward and Nancy Rufford should become, for me at least, no more than tragic shades. I seem to see poor Edward, naked and reclining amidst darkness upon cold rocks, like one of the ancient Greek damned in Tartarus, or wherever it was. As for Nancy, well, yesterday at lunch she said suddenly, "Shuttlecocks." And she repeated the word shuttlecocks 3 times. I know what was passing in her mind, if she can be said to have a mind, for Leonora has told me that once the poor girl said she felt like a shuttlecock being tossed backwards and forwards between the violent personalities of Edward and his wife. Leonora, she said, was always trying to deliver her over to Edward, and Edward tacitly and silently forced her back again. And the odd thing was that Edward himself considered that these 2 women used him like a shuttlecock. Or rather, he said that they sent him backwards and forwards like a blooming parcel that someone didn't want to pay the postage on. And Leonora also imagined that Edward and Nancy picked her up and threw her down as suited their purely vagrant moods. So there you have the pretty picture. Mind, I am not preaching anything contrary to accepted morality. I am not advocating free love in this or any other case. Society must go on, I suppose, and society can only exist if the normal, if the virtuous and slightly deceitful flourish, and if the passionate, the headstrong, and the too truthful are condemned to suicide and to madness. But I guess that I myself, in my fainter way, come into the category of the passionate, of the headstrong, and the too truthful. For I can't conceal from myself the fact that I loved Edward Ashburnham, and I love him because he was just myself. If I had had the courage and the virility, and possibly also the physique of Edward Ashburnham, I should, I fancy, have done much what he did. He seems to me like a large elder brother who took me out on several excursions, and did many dashing things while I just watched him robbing the orchards from a distance. And you see, I'm just as much of a sentimentalist as he was. Yes, society must go on. It must breed like rabbits. That is what we are here for. But then I don't like society much. I am that absurd figure, an American millionaire who has bought one of the ancient haunts of English peace. I sit here in Edward's gun-room all day and all night in a house that is absolutely quiet. No one visits me, for I visit no one. No one is interested in me, for I have no interests. In 20 minutes or so I shall walk down to the village, beneath my own oaks, alongside my own clumps of gorse, to get the American mail. My tenants, the village boys, and the tradesmen will touch their hats to me. So life peters out. I shall return to dine, and Nancy will sit opposite me with the old nurse standing behind her, enigmatic, silent, utterly well-behaved as far as her knife and fork go. Nancy will stare in front of her with the blue eyes that have over them strained, stretched brows. Once or perhaps twice during the meal her knife and fork will be suspended in mid-air, as if she were trying to think of something else that she had forgotten. Then she will say that she believes in an omnipotent deity, or she will utter the one word, shuttlecocks, perhaps. It is very extraordinary to see the perfect flush of health on her cheeks, to see the lustre of her coiled black hair, the poise of the head upon the neck, the grace of the white hands, and to think that it all means nothing. That is a picture without a meaning. Yes, it is queer. But at any rate there is always Leonora to cheer you up. I don't want to sadden you. Her husband is quite an economical person of so normal a figure that he can get quite a large proportion of his clothes ready-made. That is the great desideratum of life, and that is the end of my story. The child is to be brought up as a Romanist. It suddenly occurs to me that I have forgotten to say how Edward met his death. You remember that peace had descended upon the house, that Leonora was quietly triumphant, and that Edward said his love for the girl had been merely a passing phase. Well, one afternoon we were in the stables together, looking at a new kind of flooring that Edward was trying in a loose box. Edward was talking with a good deal of animation about the necessity of getting the numbers of the Hampshire Territorials up to the proper standard. He was quite sober, quite quiet. His skin was clear-coloured. His hair was golden and perfectly brushed. The level brick-dust red of his complexion went clean up to the rims of his eyelids. His eyes were porcelain blue, and they regarded me frankly and directly. His face was perfectly expressionless, his voice deep and rough. He stood well back upon his legs and said, "We ought to get them up to 2,350. A stable boy brought him a telegram and went away. He opened it negligently, regarded it without emotion, and in complete silence handed it to me. On the pinkish paper in a sprawling handwriting I read, "Safe Brindisi. Having rattling good time. Nancy." Well, Edward was the English gentleman, but he was also, to the last, a sentimentalist, whose mind was compounded of indifferent poems and novels. He just looked up to the roof of the stable, as if he were looking to heaven, and whispered something that I did not catch. Then he put 2 fingers into a waistcoat pocket of his grey frieze suit. They came out with a little neat penknife, quite a small penknife. He said to me, "You might just take that wire to Leonora." And he looked at me with a direct, challenging, brow-beating glare. I guess he could see in my eyes that I didn't intend to hinder him. Why should I hinder him? I didn't think he was wanted in the world. Let his confounded tenants, his rifle associations, his drunkards, reclaimed and unreclaimed, get on as they liked. Not all the hundreds and hundreds of them deserved that poor devil should go on suffering for their sakes. When he saw that I did not intend to interfere with him, his eyes became soft and almost affectionate. He remarked, "So long, old man. I must have a bit of rest, you know." I didn't know what to say. I wanted to say, God bless you, for I am also a sentimentalist. But I thought that perhaps that would not be quite English good form. So I trotted off with a telegram to Leonora. She was quite pleased with it. End of Part 4, Section 6. End of The Good Soldier by Ford Madox Ford. Recording by Greg Higgins.